In this video, I'm gonna be telling you some disturbing and honestly just plain up stories of hikers who vanished from the trail and weren't recovered until years later. Though hiking is usually a very safe activity, on rare occasions things do go fatally wrong, and as if that's not scary enough, the prospect that you could disappear for years without your friends and family knowing why or what happened is certainly even scarier. So with that said, let's take a trip to the beautiful and rugged mountains of the great state of Idaho, where in July of 2023, a hiker who was off trail deep in the backcountry made the kind of discovery that's normally reserved for nightmares. So in June of 2016, this gentleman named Jack Thomas set out on a solo backpacking trip in Idaho's Sawtooth Range, and he left from the Queens River trailhead. Now, Thomas was a very experienced outdoorsman. He was the kind of guy that felt perfectly comfortable hiking into very remote areas all by himself, and all of that despite the fact that he was 66 years old. Now, this story is not just all about his age, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, and it's also worth mentioning that as an added layer of safety, Thomas actually brought a satellite GPS device with him, and I talk about these devices a lot. They basically would have allowed him to send and receive text messages as well as call for emergency help from anywhere in the wilderness, regardless of cell connection. These things work through satellite technology, and we know that his device was in fact working because on June 15th, he actually used his GPS to send out his exact location to his family back home. This was a routine check-in, and at the time, it seemed as though everything with his hike was going according to plan. So Jack Thomas was supposed to return from his hike the following day, that would be June 16th, but unfortunately this never happened. After his check-in the previous day, there wasn't any more activity from his GPS, and it didn't take long before it became very apparent that something had gone wrong while he was in the backcountry. I mean, how the hell could a man who was carrying and routinely using a satellite GPS simply just vanish in the wilderness? A search for Jack Thomas was launched, and this search involved officials from both Elmore and Boise counties in Idaho. The government also called in a volunteer organization called Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue. Now, in case you're new to this channel, these privately run volunteer, emphasis on the volunteer search and rescue groups exist all over the country, and they're really the unsung heroes of the backcountry. Many of these groups are also extremely underfunded. Idaho Mountain Search and Rescue actually raises a significant portion of its budget by selling hot buttered corn at the Western Idaho Fair, for instance. So in an effort to give back to this group, I've made a donation to them, and I encourage you to do the same. It doesn't have to be like a crazy amount, just a couple bucks, something like that. It would be much appreciated, and I'll have a link to their website in the description if you're interested. So they're searching for Jack Thomas. They search, and after nearly 2 weeks of this, they still hadn't found any evidence about what had happened. Investigators found no clothing, they found no discarded hiking gear, and they definitely didn't find Jack Thomas or his body. And so eventually the government had no choice but to call the search off, and they did this because of lack of evidence. But Jack Thomas's family did in fact press on, utilizing private organizations to continue searching for answers. And unfortunately, over 7 years would go by before these answers would finally be found. And when they were found, by the way, it would go on to not only affect the friends and family of Jack Thomas, but also the hikers who accidentally solved the disappearance of Jack Thomas. So you could probably tell this story is about to take a disturbing turn. But with that said, there are some lessons that we can learn from it. And it's actually for that reason that I'd like to thank Aura for making it possible for me to tell you these lessons in the first place, and also making it possible for me to continuously give back to the volunteer search and rescue organizations I call out on my channel, by the way. That's right, Aura is the sponsor of this video. Now, I don't know if you heard about this, but very recently, AT&T revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, by the way, were released on the dark web. This is obviously very sketchy, and in response to this, AT&T recommended that those affected use strong passwords, pay close attention and monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. Now, that might sound like a lot to you, and it definitely is, but thankfully, this is where our sponsor Aura comes in. Aura can do all of that for you with just their one app, and thank God for that, because without Aura, you would need to download and pay for a bunch of different apps. You'd have to manage all of that stuff. It would be a total pain, and all of that just because AT&T, one company, couldn't keep your data secure. And Aura's benefits don't stop there either. Aura will also provide you with a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, identity theft insurance, and so much more. At the end of the day, Aura is pretty much your one-stop shop for all things related to your online security and your identity protection. So with that said, you can either let people continue to exploit and profit off your private information, or you can go to aura.com/KyleHatesHiking and get yourself a 14-day free trial. You can also click the link at the top of the description. One more time, aura.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get that free trial. And guys, you'll also be doing this channel a massive, massive favor when you support our sponsors. So with that said, let's get back to the story of Jack Thomas. So over 7 years after he disappeared, an anonymous hiker and one of his friends were hiking in the Sawtooth Wilderness. Now, I'm going to refer to this hiker as an anonymous hiker or our anonymous hiker because I tried to reach out to him to see if I could include his name in this video, but he never got back to me, so I just want to keep his name out of it. So, our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner were about halfway through a 6-day excursion in the backcountry when they actually decided to leave the established trail system that they were camped on and create their own route through the wilderness. The reason that they did this is because they wanted to reach these unnamed alpine lakes that didn't have any like official trails to them. So our anonymous hiker was actually well aware of Jack Thomas, who had gone missing 7 years earlier, like I said. And the reason that he was familiar with this story was because the area that Thomas had disappeared from was actually one of this anonymous hiker's favorite places. This hiker was quoted saying, he, referring to Jack Thomas, just happened to vanish into the part of the wilderness that's my favorite part to go into. The year after Jack went missing, I did a route really similar to his, and it was always in my mind, are we going to stumble upon something out here? And while this hiker wouldn't stumble upon Thomas's remains that first time, in July of 2023, as you could probably predict, that is exactly what would happen. Now, when you're in the backcountry, any like sign of human beings kind of sticks out to you, right? I'm talking about things like discarded gear or clothing, even something as small as like a candy bar wrapper that was left on the side of the trail. These things that aren't natural will catch your eye because it just looks different than everything else that you're looking at. And of course, when you're hiking off trail, this phenomenon is going to be magnified times, who even knows, a ton. Because when you're that deep in the backcountry and you're not following an established path, I mean, if you think about it, there's a pretty good chance that no other human has ever walked over that same spot, let alone accidentally dropped some gear or left something, you know, something like that. And I'm telling you this because I want to illustrate just how shocked our anonymous hiker must have been when he walked right up to a weathered pair of pants turned inside out with the underwear still attached. This anonymous hiker said, quote, "This," referring to the discovery, "was kind of a shocking thing to come upon. We were over 20 miles into the wilderness area." He also said, quote, "I knew something bad had probably happened. That's not something you usually find in such a remote place." Immediately thinking that the pants could have belonged to Jack Thomas, our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner started just looking around for more discarded items, and unfortunately, it didn't take long before they found a hiking boot. Referring to this discovery, our anonymous hiker said, quote, "I knew that somebody must have died there because you're not going anywhere without your boots," which is very valid. I mean, how could you hike into an area, lose a boot, and then still make it out. Like, I mean, that just doesn't happen. And so obviously this was not a good sign. The two men continued searching around, and they continued to find various clothing items. And then finally they stumbled upon undeniable proof that they had accidentally solved the mystery of Jack Thomas. While they were searching, our anonymous hiker and his hiking partner found a wallet which contained cards, IDs, things like this, with Jack Thomas's name on them. So the hikers make this discovery. They note the GPS coordinates where they found everything, and then they spent the next couple of days hiking back to the trailhead. Once they made it, they immediately contacted the authorities, and soon after this, a task force of investigators, coroners, and search and rescue volunteers made their way back to the location where they found even more items. So these searchers recovered Thomas's cell phone, his iPod, his backpack, and eventually his remains. Interestingly enough, they also recovered his satellite GPS, which had not been used to signal an emergency at the time of Thomas's disappearance. So the obvious question here is, what the hell happened to Jack Thomas? And the answer is, unfortunately, that we don't really know, at least not exactly. We can, however, make some educated guesses based on the location where Thomas was found and also on the gear that he was carrying, particularly that satellite GPS. So here's the timeline. Investigators believe that Thomas was hiking on the Benedict Lake Trail, and just as our anonymous hikers had done years later, Thomas decided to hike off trail to check out a nearby alpine lake. So as he was coming back down from this lake, so they do believe that he reached it and then turned around, he was roughly a half mile away from the established Benedict Lake Trail at this point. Something happened very suddenly that either killed Thomas or just left him unable to move, making him vulnerable to the elements and eventually leading to death by exposure. This would explain why he didn't hit his satellite SOS button on his device that we know he knew how to and was willing to use. So there's a few things that I want to point out about this story. First of all, I'm going to try to get ahead of what I think some of my very well-meaning viewers might comment, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. It has to do with Thomas's age. So he was 66 years old, and obviously at that age, he is going to be at higher risk for an accident while solo backpacking, especially if he was hiking off trail. Now, before you rush to judge him for this, I do just want you to remember that he was extremely experienced in the backcountry, and he was almost certainly well aware of the potential risks that he was undertaking by hiking solo. In addition to that, Jack Thomas was doing everything right with his gear, and he was carrying that satellite GPS that he could have used to call for help. And speaking of that, by the way, on this channel, I always advocate for hikers to carry these devices. I've even got a few of the popular ones tagged at the top of the description if you're curious about them and you want to check them out. But this story obviously is proof that no matter how many precautions you take, it's impossible to eliminate all risk in the outdoors. And so even if you're carrying one of these devices, they're not foolproof. And at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to make our own decisions about how much risk we're willing to tolerate. Clearly, Jack Thomas felt comfortable going solo in the backcountry, and unfortunately, that risk that he took did end up catching up with him. I wish that he was still alive today, obviously. I hope you do too, but at least he died doing what he loved, and at least he died in one of the most beautiful places on earth. My heart goes out to him, and my heart also goes out to his family. For our next story, we're gonna take a trip to a European country that is at the top of my list to visit someday. I've never been to Europe, but I definitely wanna go there. That would be Switzerland. If you're one of my European viewers or you're well-traveled, you can comment and let me know if I'm right or wrong about this, but regardless, we're taking a trip there now, and this trip is free, but if this is your first time watching the channel, you must leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you're from, and if you're a repeat viewer, you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission on this trip. You'll also be helping us inch a little bit closer towards our goal of 1 million subscribers on the Kyle Hates Hiking channel. And so subscribing, it's totally free and it's much appreciated. So from the photos and videos that I've seen, Switzerland looks absolutely stunning. I'm not kidding. I really want to go there. But beneath all that beauty, there is some subtle hidden danger, you could say, and this subtle hidden danger could potentially produce a scene like this. In July of 2023, this horrifying sight is exactly what a group of climbers in the Swiss Alps stumbled upon. On July 12th, these anonymous climbers were making their way along the Theodol Glacier, which is near the Matterhorn, when they discovered all of that discarded gear, and they also discovered some human remains. They did what I hope all of us would do in this situation, which was report it. They reported their findings to the Swiss authorities, and shortly after, some details about this deceased climber were announced to the public. And when this happened, the story went super viral. I mean, it made headlines all around the world. Even my local news station had an article about this case. I mean, it was just extremely popular, which I find very interesting because despite its virality and its popularity, there's really not much information available about this story. I will tell you what we know about this disturbing photo. So the Valais Cantonal Police, Valais, I hope I said that right, they released a statement which said that the remains belonged to a climber who had disappeared 37 years ago. I mean, that's just crazy, right? 37 years. I think that, along with the disturbing photo of the scene, that combination is why I believe the story went so viral. And yet, again, despite the popularity of the story, we don't even know the name of the climber. And that's because the Swiss authorities just haven't released it, at least not yet. We do know that this climber was a 38-year-old from Germany who disappeared on a hike in September of 1986. The police used DNA technology to find the identity of this man, and they explained that the discovery was a result of receding glaciers in the area. This is not the only time this has happened, by the way. In 2015, the bodies and the gear of 2 missing Japanese climbers were also discovered near the Matterhorn. Apparently, these 2 mountaineers had perished in a dangerous snowstorm all the way back in 1970. This disturbing trend of discoveries doesn't stop there either. In December of 1979, 27-year-old Jonathan Conville set out to climb the north face of the Matterhorn with one of his friends. So Conville was from Britain, and he was a very skilled mountaineer. But with that said, this particular route was very difficult, very technical, and very, very dangerous. On Christmas Day, Conville and his climbing partner made 6 hours worth of progress up the mountain before having to stop and camp for the night. They woke up the next morning and they continued their push up until they were roughly 1,600 feet or about 500 meters away from the summit of the Matterhorn. So they're obviously super close to reaching, their goal, the summit of the mountain, but unfortunately, the unpredictable mountain weather did catch up to them at this point. It was storming, it was just so dangerous up there, and so they decided to abandon their summit push, even though they were so close, and they instead started to traverse over to an emergency hut where they knew that they could have some shelter and that they could wait for rescue. They began descending, and as they did this, a rock underneath Conville came loose, and he instantly fell out of sight of his friend. Now, this friend did end up making it to the hut, and this friend was later rescued by helicopter, but unfortunately, Jonathan Conville was nowhere to be found. He was obviously presumed to have died in that accident, but the location of his body remained a mystery throughout the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. I mean, well over 30 years went by, but then in 2013, a Swiss helicopter pilot noticed some abandoned climbing gear while he was flying, above the mountain. This sighting was definitely concerning, and so it was investigated, and as it would turn out, this was not just some random pile of discarded equipment. It was actually a site that contained human remains. And along with these remains was a shirt that had the name Jonathan Conville written on it. Conville's siblings provided DNA samples, and soon after, it was unsurprisingly confirmed that Jonathan Conville had been found. The silver lining to this story, I guess, is that Conville's family would actually end up starting the Jonathan Conville Memorial Trust, which works to, quote, honor Jonathan's legacy by equipping young climbers with the skills and understanding they need to explore the mountains safely. I think that's really cool. I mean, they could have just been like totally against climbing after it killed their loved one, but that's not what they're doing. Instead, they're trying to get more people out there in a safe manner. I'll actually have a link to this trust in the description if you're curious and want to learn more about it or learn more about Jonathan Conville's story. So the discovery of Conville's remains was also linked to receding glaciers on the Matterhorn, just like the more recent discovery of this anonymous German hiker. If this trend continues, I have a feeling that a lot more families out there may finally be getting some answers about what happened to their loved ones who disappeared while they were climbing. And speaking of families getting answers, that's exactly what happened in our next story. Except just like in all the previous stories, this one also took just way too long for these answers to finally come. In October of 2019, 28-year-old Rachel Lakoduk set out into the Washington State wilderness on a hike that she'd been planning for quite some time. Now, Rachel had become fixated on spending the night at a place called Hidden Lake Lookout, which is a cabin that actually sits on the border of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest and North Cascades National Park. The cabin is located at roughly 6,900 feet or some 2,100 meters in elevation. Rachel had originally planned to do this overnight backpacking trip with her husband. They almost did it in 2018, in fact, but they kind of decided last minute that they just weren't physically ready for this, and because of that, they scrapped their first attempt. They didn't give up the plans entirely, though. They kind of said, like, okay, we'll do it in 2019, I guess, but unfortunately, they ended up having some relationship problems, and that definitely threw a wrench into their plans. And so by the end of the summer of 2019, their marriage had fractured. And though they didn't actually get divorced yet, Rachel had moved out of their home at that point, and the couple was separated. But despite this, Rachel was still determined to spend the night at the lookout. And thus, on October 17th, 2019, she drove herself to the Hidden Lake trailhead and she parked her car. Her plan was to hike the roughly 4 miles of steep, rough, uphill terrain until she reached the cabin at the lookout, and then she was going to spend the night and then hike back down to her car the following day. Tragically, once Rachel left the safety of the trailhead, she would never make it back alive. So I really need to point something out right now, and this is probably something that a lot of you might have already noticed, especially if you're an experienced hiker in the North Cascades. So what I'm talking about here is that October 17th is pretty late in the season for somebody to be hiking at almost 7,000 feet in elevation, at least assuming this person isn't like an experienced hiker in cold, snowy, and icy conditions. Now, I'm not sure how much backcountry experience Rachel had, but I do know that it's easy to underestimate how dangerous the higher elevations can be in October. I mean, down in town, it might be fairly warm still. It probably won't be snowing, but up on these mountain peaks, it can definitely be just straight up winter conditions at that time of year. My understanding is that the reason Rachel set out so late in the season was because this hike was actually a celebration of her 28th birthday, which was October 17th, the very same day that she left. And as it would turn out, Rachel's birthday in 2019 would also coincide with the very first winter storm of the year. Once again, the conditions at the lower elevations were manageable, but as Rachel climbed higher and higher, the snow, the wind, the ice, and the cold would have become worse and worse. I mean, visibility was limited, and the falling snow had started to hide the trail. I mean, it would have been very difficult to see where the trail was and to follow it. When Rachel was a little bit further than like the halfway point through her climb, she actually encountered a pair of hikers who were coming back down the trail. So they kind of passed in opposite directions. Now, these hikers had also been climbing up towards the lookout, but they were ahead of Rachel. They'd started earlier, and when they finally got above tree line, the conditions were just awful. The conditions had deteriorated so much, and these hikers made a wise decision to turn around. So when they passed Rachel, they chatted with her for a few minutes, and they did reportedly warn her about the dangerous conditions that were up ahead of her, but they also said that Rachel looked confident and she looked strong. Whatever happened during that encounter, it did not dissuade Rachel from continuing her hike. And so they passed each other. Rachel continued climbing, and unfortunately, these hikers that she chatted with would end up being the last people to ever see her alive. The very next day, Rachel was supposed to get home from her hike, and then later she was supposed to meet up with one of her friends, but she failed to show up to this meeting, and she also failed to respond to any attempts to contact her, by the way. And so because of this, she was quickly reported missing, and her car was soon found parked at the Hidden Lake Lookout trailhead. This was a disturbing find because it was clear at this point that Rachel had not made it off of the mountain. The inclement weather in the area, the very same weather that presumably led Rachel astray, also made search efforts extremely difficult. I mean, they weren't even able to make it to the cabin initially. This was significant because they hoped that Rachel had actually made it to the cabin and was just taking shelter inside, waiting for rescue there, and that's why she hadn't returned from her hike. However, this cabin was finally searched on October 22nd, and of course, Rachel, she wasn't in there. Because of this, it appeared as though she had vanished somewhere between the cabin and the location that she had her encounter with the two descending hikers. They searched hard for 10 days after Rachel disappeared, but unfortunately, after this, the official search was suspended. However, private searchers working with Rachel's family actually continued search efforts, and the craziest part about this is they did not stop for literal years. Now, from what I can tell, the man who organized, we'll say, the bulk of the search efforts after the government stopped searching was named Bud Carr. Now, if you do like a Google search on Bud Carr, you'll quickly see that he kind of has like a controversial story, or at least that's what the media makes things seem like. Who knows what's true, but I'm not gonna get into any of that because it pales in significance to the events that happened on August 14th, 2021. On that day, Carr, a man named Kevin Dares, and a few other anonymous searchers were out on yet another attempt to find Rachel when all of a sudden Kevin Dares stumbled upon some weathered backpacking gear. After some brief radio conversation between the searchers, they determined that the backpack, sleeping bag, and sleeping pad that Dares had found matched the color and description of Rachel's missing gear. Dares also reportedly noticed some red hair as well. And so nearly 2 years after she had vanished, Rachel Lakoduk had been found. When I was researching this case, it quickly became apparent to me that the discovery of Rachel's remains was, we'll say, much different than most other cases that I've covered on this channel. I could be wrong about this, so somebody please correct me if that's the case, but I think Bud Carr and his team, they weren't like an official nonprofit or volunteer search and rescue organization, and they definitely weren't with the government. Instead, they were just a group of private citizens who wanted to serve Rachel's friends and family and wanted to find her. And this is a somewhat controversial concept, you know, private people going out and trying to solve these cases. But regardless of that, you cannot argue with the results in this case. Hats off to Bud Carr and his team. And with that said, again, the obvious question in this case is what the hell happened to Rachel? Unfortunately, again, we'll probably never know for sure, but it's likely that she took a wrong turn due to the trail being covered in snow and not being able to see it. And then eventually she decided that she needed to just bushwhack back down the mountain. And then at some point, she likely settled down to try and like seek refuge from the bad weather. And in this place that she chose, she ended up just perishing, probably due to exposure. A very, very sad story. And there's two things about Rachel's gear setup that I think could have led to less tragic results here. I'm definitely not trying to criticize Rachel. Let me be perfectly clear about that, but I just can't help but wonder if things might have ended differently if she was carrying a tent or a shelter with her. Also, to be clear, I'm not 100% sure what her gear setup was. So again, if I'm wrong about this, somebody please correct me. I'm trying to, only say the truth here and serve you guys. With that said, I don't think that Rachel was carrying a tent, presumably because she was planning on staying inside that cabin at the lookout. It's certainly possible that just a tent alone wouldn't have been enough to save her life, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt either. So with that said, I urge all hikers, even if you're planning on staying in a backcountry structure or like a shelter or something like that, you should always carry a tent or at least like a bivvy, a backup shelter in case you don't actually make it to the structure you're planning on sleeping in. I didn't read any reports that Rachel was carrying a satellite GPS either. And as we learned earlier in the video, these devices aren't foolproof, and so you can't say that it certainly would have saved her life, but it definitely, I think there's a pretty good chance that it would have made a big difference. If she was stuck there, if she was hunkered down, she could have hit the SOS button, and they would have been able to find her location and rescue her before she died. Those are some important lessons that I took away from this story. May Rachel Lakoduk rest in peace, and my heart goes out to her friends and her family. Thank you all so much for watching, and the YouTube algorithm seems to think that you would like this video to watch next, so why not give it a try? Click that video, and I'll see you next time.